Thank you very much indeed. And it is a great pleasure for me to be speaking to you in Nest Bharat under your series that is called The Talk. And I'm also very pleased to see that yours is an organization that is collecting together a group of women students between 15 and 35, especially now that you can see with the recent women's reservation bill that has been passed. The country itself is beginning to realize the power of Nari Shakti, and I think it is quite important and interesting that this has happened now. And I would like to spend let us say, 20 to 25 minutes on discussing some highlights actually of the work of Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. And it has to be just a few highlights because Professor Radhakrishnan was very prolific, and in the course of about 60 years of active professional life, he wrote about 60 books. So, literally, he was writing about one book every year, which is quite an impressive record. Also, considering the fact that in the last 10 to 15 years of his professional life, he was also involved in the political life of the country. Now, for somebody who was this prolific and who wrote about a large number of topics, from the very serious down to what could be called popular subjects, one can only put a few highlights in place. And so, what I thought I would do is firstly point out these highlights. Now, the first book that he wrote was his MA thesis when he was just 20 years old, called Ethics of the Vedanta. And this was a very brave topic to take up for a 20-year-old person who came from basically a poor background. But this small thesis contains many of the highlights of things that he wrote about several years later. And the main theme over here is that he said that philosophy does not fall outside the bounds of religion and science. So the notice these two, both religion and science, are things he spoke about throughout his life. Normally, philosophy and religion are supposed to be quite distinct from each other, but Radhakrishnan showed in many of his works that it is impossible to separate these two in any religion and more particularly in Hinduism. Now, that is the first step. It set the stage for many of the things he did later. And it was clear that by the time he wrote this master's thesis, he was about 20 years old in 1907 or so. It was clear he had already read the works of Swami Vivekananda because the influence of Vivekananda is to be clearly seen in this master's thesis. Now, as we move along, we find that the turning point in his career actually came when he moved to Calcutta in 1920 as a professor of philosophy in Calcutta University. Now, Calcutta at that point was the intellectual capital of the country. And from then on, he also started becoming aware of the national situation, the freedom struggle, and what Indian intellectuals could do in this whole larger venture. So many of his philosophical writings started getting the nationalistic color right from this point onwards. And the most important book in this early phase is what is called the Hindu view of life, which is a very small, slim book. I think it is less than about 100 pages or so. It's not much thicker than that. And there are four chapters. This Hindu view of life, many people feel, is one of the best introductions to Radhakrishnan's work. And I understand that your group has also studied this particular book. Now, the Hindu view of life, after nearly it's 95 years old since it was first published, is, I mean, still selling in Google for 200 rupees and the Kindle version for 100 rupees. So, which means it's not every book which is 100 years old that continues to sell like this. And so, clearly, it means many people have found this to be an extremely good introduction. There are four chapters, and they are titled, chapter one is called Religious Experience, Its Nature and Content. So, he talks about the nature of religion itself. And make no mistake, in the Hindu view of life, he affirms that Hinduism is a religion. Now, we hear a lot about Hinduism being a view of life, a way of life, and I'll come to this point a little bit later. But in chapter 1, he will definitely state that it is a religion indeed, and it shares the characteristics of many other religions. It is not merely a way of life, whatever that might be. The chapter 2, he calls it Conflict of Religions and the Hindu Attitude. Now, throughout this book and elsewhere, Radhakrishnan has declared that if you have each religion saying that it alone is the best, this is going to lead to a lot of tensions among people. Because you can't have every religion saying that they are the best and the others are no good. And he says that this is where Hinduism really comes into its own, because Hinduism really doesn't talk about some religion sort of being the best and others not being the best. It simply says that various religions are only different routes to finding the absolute, which in Sanatana Dharma, of course, is called Brahman. Now, in the Hindu view of life, which incidentally it is the book form of a series of lectures that he gave in Oxford University in 1926. The book was published in 1927. And so he talks about different religions as different colleges in the same university. So he says a member of each college may think that he or she is in the best college. But he says that everybody studies to get the same degree issued by the university. So he says different religions are like different colleges in a university. And the degree given by the university is the realization of the absolute through spiritual means. Throughout his books and his works, he was a very good public speaker. He was able to give these analogies that allowed very complex themes to be understood in very simple ways. Now, in the end, really, one should not come away feeling that in this process of every religion being an equally valid way of finding the absolute, Radhakrishnan definitely states that, and it's easiest if I were to read from Hindu View of Life, page 36, and he says, it is not altogether fair to it when it suggests that for Hinduism, there is nothing to choose between one revelation and another. It does not say that all the routes are equally easy. Hinduism does not mistake tolerance for indifference. It affirms that while all revelations refer to reality, they are not equally true to it. These are very important words. Probably, one of the most important sentences in this Hindu view of life. because it says that every person might try to approach the Almighty in their own way, but eventually he says that they will realize that the Hindu way of seeking the absolute is the best way. At the same time, the religion is sufficiently broad minded that it says each person, each man and woman try to find their own ways. He says that inevitably they will come back to Sanatana Dharma. And here he is echoing many things that Vivekananda said in this idea of what is called Neo Hinduism. That is, that Sanatana Dharma is actually a platform that stands higher than religions. Now, at this point, I would like to say a little bit about religion and way of life. Now, people use these words quite loosely today and say that Hinduism is not a religion, it is only a way of life. And this immediately brings up Hinduism, especially in the political context, to attack by people from the Abrahamic religions. But the thing is, what is the distinction? Actually, in an easy way, I can tell you the first two chapters of Hindu view of life talk about Hinduism as a religion. The third and fourth chapters, which are called Hindu Dharma 1 and Hindu Dharma 2, describe Hinduism as a way of life. So, the thing about Hinduism is that it has characteristics both of a religion and of a way of life. Now, let's go through some of these things. It is very complex and has a diverse belief system that encompasses a wide range of philosophical, spiritual, and religious ideas. There are religious ideas, various schools of philosophy and thought, mythologies, practices. It is this complexity that makes it a religion. The other very important thing about Hinduism is that there is a belief in the divine. So, if you believe in God, basically you're talking about a religious practice, not a way of life. Way of life doesn't say that you have to believe in God. Then Hinduism also has things like temples, priests, deities, rituals, prayers, sacred books. All these things are associated with the religion. And finally, there is a spiritual quest. This business of spirit, Radhakrishnan always says that religion is a deeply personal and inward looking thing. The external rituals may be there, and throughout his works, he decries some of the cruder forms of ritual worship. But he also says that in the end, religion is something where a person looks within himself. And in his own words, religion refers to our common spiritual struggles and inspiration. So you try to find the absolute within yourself. And so it is a deeply personal, deeply individual thing. So religion at the highest level is something like this. Now let's move on because for lack of time, I could spend all the time discussing Hindu view of life. We move on to the next highlight, which I wanted to point out. This is the idealist view of life, also based on a series of lectures he gave a few years later in England. And the idealist view is perhaps one of the most secular of Radhakrishnan's works because there are not too many references to religious practices or religious philosophies as such. But idealist view is more concerned with the thought processes of individuals. So Radhakrishnan distinguishes between what he calls is intellectual knowledge and what is called intuitive knowledge. Now, these two are actually quite different. And I have spoken and I've talked about the differences between these two, especially when it comes to scientific discoveries like periodic table, discovery of DNA, structure of benzene, and so on. But the important difference between intellectual knowledge and instinctive knowledge is that the basis of intellectual knowledge is communicability. So when you do something, when you think something, you should be able to tell somebody else how you arrived at this in a thought process involving some logical sequence of events. In an intuitive knowledge, however, there comes a particular gap where you are unable to describe the thought process any more accurately. And at this stage, one relies on blind intuition to make a quantum jump in your thinking. Radhakrishnan argues very convincingly in Idealist View that intuitive knowledge is not anti logic, it is just, he calls it supra logical. So there comes a point where the intellectual thinking and logical thinking can only take you so far. Suddenly there will be a jump. And this has happened in very great scientific discoveries. When suddenly I can tell you for example, the discovery of the structure of benzene in 1869 by Kekulé. Kekulé was actually sleeping and half asleep, half dreaming when he saw a snake swallowing its tail. And suddenly he realized that benzene had a cyclic structure. This is something that nobody had thought about. And in his scientific paper, he actually wrote that scientists should dream in order that they get the correct result sometimes. So, idealist view is actually an excellent uh, way of looking at thinking in the Hindu canon, especially in Sanatana Dharma. If the essence of intellectual thinking is communicability, the essence of intuitive thinking is certainty. You are sure of that fact, and that is why you feel that that is what has, there can be no other solution to the problem other than what you are sure of. And it actually supports the statement aham brahmasmi very well, because when you're actually the thing that you are studying or thinking about, you don't dissociate yourself anymore from you as an individual and what you are thinking about or what you are studying. Both are exactly one and the same. And this is really what we mean when we say that communicability is the essence of intellectual knowledge, while certainty is the essence of intuitive knowledge. Now, to move on, there is another very interesting book. See, in this talk, which is a brief half an hour talk, I do not propose to get into the heavier philosophical works like Indian philosophy, the principal Upanishads, and the Brahma Sutra. That requires very detailed study and requires a series of lectures actually to start thinking even about bits of these books. I am taking certain works which will more appeal to the general audience, beginners, people who are interested in Sanatan Dharma, who are interested in what Radhakrishnan has said with relation to the India of today. In this context, this book, Religion and Society, which he wrote in the darkest days of World War II, 1942, is of great note. In this book, he wrote that religion and society are actually connected. He says they are intricately connected with both, and they should both harmoniously coexist. Spirituality, ethical values, and tolerance, he says, is an essential part of every society. He talks about Hitler in that book, and he describes him as the antithesis of practically every human value that is known up to that point. And there are three extracts from this book which are particularly interesting, where he defines in a sentence each uh, philosophy, religion, and science. Now, let us take these in order. Philosophy. Philosophy visualizes a universal consciousness at the back of nature and humanity. Visualizes a universal consciousness at the back of nature and humanity. So, what is this universal consciousness? This is something that philosophers strive towards. Religion refers to our common spiritual struggles and aspirations. So, the spiritual thing comes again. So, the spiritual struggle, the aspiration to find yourself, to find Brahman, this is what he calls religion. And then he says science reveals identical cosmic elements as the basis of human life. Science reveals identical cosmic elements. Philosophy visualizes a universal consciousness. and religion refers to a common spiritual struggle. I don't see any difference between these three, the way Radhakrishnan has defined it. And his definition of science is actually very close to what Feynman said. I know I will quote Feynman again to you when he says, a very nice quotation. He says, if in some cataclysm all scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the fewest words? I believe it is the atomic hypothesis, as the atomic fact, or whatever you wish to call it, that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion. There are only 120 of these little particles. And the thing about these things that we call atoms is that you don't know their position and momentum simultaneously. So already there is a distinction. The transition between matter and mind is being created. This is pretty close to Radhakrishnan's definition of science in religion and society. So this means whatever the subject that great thinkers were into, their ultimate idea went back to God, spirituality, finding oneself, and trying to see what meaning you can make of your own life in the larger context. Now, here I will say just a few words in his interlude into political matters because he was one of the members of the Constituent Assembly. And in this context, he made many important interjections in the Constitutional Assembly debates that led to framing of certain things in the Constitution. And in the famous midnight speech of midnight of 14th August 47, he defines a civilization. He says civilization is a thing of the spirit. Once again, the spirit word comes. It is not something external, solid, and mechanical. It is the dream in people's hearts. It is the inward aspiration in people's souls. Again, this emphasis on inward thinking and the soul. Hmm. It is the imaginative interpretation of the human life. What he said in Religion and Society about religion and science. Imaginative interpretation of the human life condition and the perception of the mystery of human existence. This is how he defines civilization. And notice how similar it is to his definition of religion. Religion refers to our common spiritual struggles and aspirations, which means that he finds no distinction between religion and civilization. So, today, when you're talking about India trying to find itself as a civilizational state, one again goes back to Swami Vivekananda, who says that all things in India go back to a religious origin. So he says if you try to put any secular themes to the people of India, he says your efforts are bound to be a failure. Notice that all these things that I'm saying here are actually quite religion neutral. They could as well be valid for somebody who follows a religion other than Sanatana Dharma. Finding yourself, finding the spirit, finding the meaning of life, finding the nature of reality. These are all very, very personal, individual things. And this is why we say that in India we are always chasing the higher spirit. And this is what distinguishes a civilizational state from the Abrahamic states or the nation states of the West. Very interesting that today people in Russia are thinking on these lines. And the name of Alexander Dugin comes to mind immediately. And the people in Russia thinking about civilizational states actually say that they have compared this democracy as defined in the West as a feature of Kali Yuga. And they say if you do this kind of indiscriminate democracy, you will get in the end only plutocracy, which means it is the rule of the very rich people. And they said this results in the final debasement of society itself, which leads to today's modern woke culture. Now, actually, it's very interesting. In Idealist View itself, Radhakrishnan describes people who could very well be today's wokes. I mean, he wrote this 90 years ago. He says there are people, he calls them modish skeptics for whom nothing is serious, who drift along in a confused way, hoping for the best, expecting little, and believing in nothing very much. Quite a good description of what we call woke behavior today. So it means that people have faced these kinds of challenges and struggles throughout. The very last, I would say that I have just about 2 3 minutes left before about half an hour is over. I must say a little bit since I am in the academic line myself. I must say that he did speak quite a lot on education. After his term as the chairman of the what was called Radhakrishnan Committee of 1948, what is called the Universities Commission, where he really brought in some of his ideas from the earlier years into the education sphere. And in many of his speeches and lectures, when he was the vice president and president of India, he has spoken about education. Education is something, he was a vice chancellor of two universities already, Andhra University in the 30s and Benares Hindu University in the 40s. So he had been a vice chancellor, he had tremendous experience as a teacher and an educationist. And people who have heard his philosophy lectures have attested that he was an extremely good lecturer and a good teacher. Now he says, in India, therefore, any satisfactory system of education should aim at a balanced growth of the individual and insist on both knowledge and wisdom. You know, today the present lacuna in our thing is that we have people with a lot of knowledge but very little wisdom. And it is this balance that is seriously lacking in our education system today. And then he says also his partiality towards his own subjects. Wisdom comes easier with literature, philosophy, and religion. And then he says, if you don't get this knowledge, you will get into your brain will become a slum, he says. And then he says, mental slums are more dangerous to mankind than material slums. So when we talk about Swachh Bharat and all that today, I would like to see the real Swachh Bharat coming when we, the people of Bharat, are able to clean the mental slums in our heads, which are more dangerous, according to him, than the material slums. Then he says also, here is another beautiful quotation on the universities. He says the function of the universities is not merely to send out technically skilled and professionally competent men, but those who have the quality of compassion. This is something that all IIT graduates should learn. They may be skilled and professionally competent. Are they compassionate? Without this, he says, the student becomes a demon. And he quotes a nice one. He says, Sa aksharo viparitatve rakshaso bhavati dhrivam. So you become a demon if you don't have that compassion. So he said a lot about science. He says science is knowledge and power. It has interest and utility. It is illuminating and fruitful. It reveals the inexhaustible richness of the world. Science, however, does not deal with the non intellectual aspects of human nature, your intuitive thinking, morality, truth, and tolerance come incidentally through science and not immediately. So it requires, he says, scientists of a very high order to be able to acquire these qualities that people who study the softer disciplines acquire very, very naturally. Throughout his long life, by the way, he wrote a lot about science and he tried to link in science in many places with philosophy and religion. Finally, before I log off, he could be quite political in some of his utterances. And here is something which I think is quite relevant to India today. He said this in the early 50s, shortly after independence. He says he was never critical in his works. He was never afraid to be critical of Indians in the things he spoke and said. He says, we are intellectually poor, you know, inwardly torn, profoundly uneasy, and ignorant of the future. These are the forebodings of evil. The bonds that unite us are rudely sundered by politics. Okay? We have a small but influential minority of leaders. Listen to this carefully. We have a small but influential minority of leaders who depend for their existence on Indian disunity, or at any rate profit from it, and therefore feel no sort of longing for Indian unity. So he said as early as 1950s, he was saying that there are leaders in India who want India to be not united. So you can see this is a sort of warning, and also kind of a, there's a foreboding when very great people say things. Some of the things that they say become true for all times. He could be actually describing the Tukade gang when he talks about this. And above all, I will now finally finish, but I will finish off with what is probably my favorite quotation from Radhakrishnan's many writings and speeches. And this is another thing which he said in the midnight debate on 14th August 47. Our opportunities are great, but let me warn you that when power outstrips ability, we will fall on evil days. When power outstrips ability, we will fall on evil days. We should develop competence and ability which would help us to utilize the opportunities which are now open to us. More often than not, we see power outstripping ability in India. And once again, his words look really prophetic. I will conclude by saying that Radhakrishnan is a name that is not much remembered today. Everyone knows him as a president of India, vice president, and so on. And as was mentioned, Teachers' Day, something we do on 5th of September, and then, we say some nice things about our own teachers. But the fact of the matter really is that when you look through his works, both the very serious ones, as well as the middling ones, as well as the lightest things that he used to speak and write about in his political days, there is a message here for young Indians. You are in an age group of 15 to 35. You are at the age when reading about some of these things will hopefully help you to get a perspective and grasp on this wonderful land called Bharat, in which we are all lucky enough to be born and we live in this place. And you should be able to appreciate more some of the very unique features of this land. And this is something that when you do an overall reading of Radhakrishnan's works, this is a sort of appreciation that you slowly start gathering, and your admiration and respect for this great personality from the past only increases by leaps and bounds. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for your kind attention.